You're listening to episode 212 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Our returning guest, Winton Higgins, speaks with us about some key challenges facing secular Buddhists in contemporary society. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. Secular Buddhism is new and growing on a daily basis. Just this week, Practice Director for the SBA, Mark Nickelbein, and I have had wonderful conversations with those passionate about our particular approach to the tradition and refreshed our own understanding that there are many doors and paths to take. The secret of how this effort has grown is really no secret at all. Our culture is fertile soil for secular Buddhism, and people in it have an appetite for open learning and practice, guided by what we experience in this life. Of course, there are still challenges, and our understanding of those also grows on a daily basis. How we relate to others that are more traditional than ourselves, how we communicate skillfully about our practice, are ongoing and evolving areas for exploration and learning. Winton Higgins began meditating and practicing the Dharma in the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order in 1987. In 1994, he became an active supporter of Wat Buddha Dhamma, where he began to lead meditation retreats in 1995. Since then, he has led retreats for the Wat, the Blue Gum Sangha, and Sydney Insight Meditators, and taught many courses for the Buddhist Library in Sydney. He follows the Western Insight tradition and is particularly interested in the convergence of Dharma practice and progressive Western values such as democracy, feminism, and critical inquiry. Winton is a writer and social science academic. He and his partner Lena have 2 grown-up daughters and a grandson. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Nilgiri Chamraj tea. Our guest today, returning to us, is Winton Higgins. Winton, welcome back. Good to hear your voice again.
Thank you, Ted, and I'm glad to be back.
So we're going to talk a bit about some programming you've been doing recently on thoughts you put together on 4 frontiers for secular Buddhists. First, why don't you tell us a little bit about what that is? What are the programs that you've been doing, and how has that been received?
Well, here in Sydney in particular, there's been quite an interest building up over the last 4 or 5 years, thanks to visits by Stephen and Martine Batchelor. And I think the kind of secular Buddhism that they have been promulgating had a certain resonance with Australian culture, particularly urban culture. So I've been following that and also developing particular emphases, I guess, in relation to secular Buddhism, which I think are probably slightly different from the way others have launched it, but not in any way in contradiction to more mainstream ways of talking about secular Buddhism.
And that's one of the nice advantages I think we have in a secular approach is that we are tending to be fairly open, and we do see that there are different ways to be secular Buddhist practitioners. I know that there are other ways to do it that are equally valid ways to come to the practice.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the enormous strengths of secular Buddhism is that it has no orthodoxy. So people can be as creative and as original as they want to be and still be within the fold, if indeed there is a fold at all.
You mentioned two things, Winton, I'd like to ask about. First was the dialogues that Stephen and Martine have had have resonated with Australian culture. And I'm wondering if you could expand upon that a little bit for those of us who aren't where you are and are really quite innocently ignorant of what that culture is like. What is the resonance for them?
Well, I think that the culture in what one might quaintly call the old empire or the former old empire, which covers Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, is markedly less religious than what appears to be the case in the United States. And this is no doubt due to the very different kind of historical origins of these social formations. I mean, the United States culture is much more religious than any other Western culture. And I guess, it's just assumed that if one is religious, and fewer and fewer of us are, then this is a sort of private preoccupation, and it really has nothing to do with one sharing a reality construct. I suppose, what one might call a culturally dominant reality construct, which virtually everybody just takes for granted in these sorts of countries. And, the mainstays of that are evolutionary biology, the Big Bang theory, and neuroscience these days. And so, these are sort of uncontroversial pillars of a particular kind of culture, which historically has crowded out religious conceptions of the same subject matters.
You had also mentioned that your approach may be a little different than some others, and I'm wondering if you could help tell us a little bit more about that too.
Yes, one of the things that preoccupies me greatly is the remarkable convergence between what we find in the Pali Canon, once we read the Pali Canon directly rather than through the medium of later commentaries, which have been generated by various monastic orthodoxies. Once we go back to the source, we're looking at ideas that have an extraordinary resonance with post metaphysical Western thought. And I'm thinking particularly of phenomenology, but that would also include hermeneutics and existentialism and a few other such strains of Western philosophy in particular. So I guess I'm interested in that. And I'm also interested in pushing the idea that culture really mediates all our experience. We can't stand outside our culture. Our culture, of course, includes our language. And the whole idea that we are kind of accessing pre-cultural or pre-linguistic truths just seems to me to be nonsense. And in that case, of course, we have to understand how our culture is filtering and is molding our experience. So there's a kind of active translation going on when we compare what's going on in the Pali Canon with what makes sense to us in the 21st century in whatever culture we find ourselves. And that seems to me an enormously fertile field to be ploughing. particularly as we're talking in both instances of the very complex and manifold nature of our experience, which the Pali Canon freely acknowledges. And it's therefore, for instance, that you don't find the Buddha recommending formulaic forms of meditation, because meditation should allow one to directly access one's experience in all its uniqueness and all its complexity and all its subtlety. And this, of course, is a basic idea of phenomenology, which is why to read the Satipatthana Sutta, Buddha's main teaching on meditation, is to recognize something that is alive and well in 21st century Western world.
And I'd agree with that, especially since that direct experience, what is happening in our lives today, again, this is very much the secular approach, is keeping it live and applicable to what's going on within our context, whatever that context is. And I would say that's not just fertile soil, that's infinitely fertile soil, because that's always going to be unique in its own particular time.
Yes, and I guess I'd add the further point that sometimes what worries me about debates between secularists and atheists on the one hand and religionists on the other in the United States is that they are agreeing on terms of the debate that I don't think they should be agreeing on, which is that there is a kind of metaphysical, objective truth out there, and now we're going to fight about who actually owns it and who is actually recognizing it accurately. The point of post-metaphysical thought is to abandon that conception of truth altogether. And really, there is no difference between what we are actually experiencing and truth. The whole idea that there is appearance versus essence has been abolished in post-metaphysical thought, and it's an abolitionism I think we can all join in with enthusiasm.
Yeah, and one of the challenges I think we all face is that a certain level of caution that we not then take that concept that you've just described and apply it perhaps a little unskillfully, such that, oh, well, then any concept I have is valid truth and every bit as valid as anything else, which isn't quite what we're talking about.
No, it has nothing to do with relativism, really. It has to do with having a much more dynamic understanding of the human being as an unfolding event or unfolding complexity of events rather than as a fixed entity. And so if you have this concept of fixed entities, then it's easy to either go into the religious slash scientific view of metaphysical truth or abandon the field entirely by adopting a relativist position. I think that the wonderful thing about phenomenology is it is a middle way between those two unhelpful dead ends.
So, Winton, tell us a bit about the programs that you've been doing around the Four Frontiers for Secular Buddhists piece that you've written.
Well, last year I ran a series of workshops in Melbourne, Sydney, and Wellington, New Zealand, which was basically introducing secular Buddhism and how it not only changes our worldview, but it changes our approaches to Dharma practice. And this I would regard as kind of, secular Buddhism basics. So those seemed to go over pretty well. And I then wondered how I would run the follow up workshops that I've been asked to run. And I thought I might take a walk on the wild side. And instead of talking about basics, I would talk about what seemed to me to be those issues that were probably likely to be most controversial to secular Buddhists, but which we really need to start to probe into. And so I took up this concept of the frontier. Frontier is, has kind of two sides to it. Frontier is usually an area of ambiguity, of ambivalence. There are no clear borders. It's hard to, be able to get a settled view of what's going on there. And the other thing is that a frontier is usually where two different cultures or two different civilizations meet. So that's why I've kind of adopted this idea of frontiers, and I identified four because the workshops gave me four sessions to work with. But these seem to be the four that leapt to mind when I was planning the workshops.
So tell us, what were the four that you decided within the time constraints you had that you went with?
Well, the first one had to do with our attitude to religion. This was inspired, I suppose, by a certain impatience with the new atheists who just seem to be leading us onto very barren ground. The kind of thing I was speaking to earlier, that there was a kind of World War III fought on the ground of metaphysics, and we should not be on that ground at all. And that the new atheists are simply old-style 19th century scientific rationalists, and we should have moved on from that now. And that religions aren't interesting because of what sorts of reality constructs they peddle, but because of the experiences that they generate. And this work actually has interesting antecedents in American thought, particularly William James, who was interested in the experience of religion, which has nothing to do with its truth or falsehood, but the kind of epiphanies people have, and the kind of warm, gooey feelings that religious observance often generates. And what is all that about? So, what I was suggesting there is that secular Buddhists should see religious traditions as objects of interest, objects that raise questions about, okay, where do we go with our ecstatic states, and how do we interpret them, that sort of thing, all of course of great interest to meditators. The second point I wanted to get to was the whole issue of transcendence. So this was the second frontier, the modern philosophical doctrine of finitude, which basically goes back to Heidegger, the main figure in phenomenology, because it seems to me that traditional Buddhism was kind of in the same racket as traditional Abrahamic religions of selling eternal life. There's a very interesting current in Western philosophy that says that it's terribly important, if you're going to live well, to live a meaningful and dignified human life, to base it on the premise that you're going to die and that's it. So death becomes a kind of a basic premise with how we approach a life well lived. And so it seemed to me to be really important to settle accounts with all conceptions of rebirth, as well as conceptions of heaven and turning into an angel or an arahant and all that stuff. So it's a kind of, battle cry of the human being, that we are what we are vulnerable, we are mortal, and how do we build on that rather than how do we escape? The third one had to do precisely with issues of transcendence and what we often experience or interpret as transcendence, but which is in fact much better understood in terms of sublime experiences. And here I was following Stephen Batchelor's much more recent work on how meditation is about the everyday sublime. If we don't go through life with our heads full of abstractions, either drawn from religion or science, if we actually turn towards our everyday lives in all their immediacy, we realize that they are absolutely amazing. And so, in a recent publication, Stephen has said that the everyday sublime is the whole point of meditation. It has nothing to do with, going into states of absorption or seeing Buddhas or anything like that. It is really a way of delving further and more deeply and more imaginatively in what is actually happening right now. And this converges very well with how the Zen practitioners have usually always seen their own practice. So what we need to do, I think, is rescue a conception of the sublime and rescue it from those who can't experience it at all because their heads are in the wrong place, and also rescue it from all sorts of extraneous theories about transcendence, eternal life, turning into an angel, and all that stuff.
Well, it seems that all three that you've described so far are challenges for us as secularists to not give up those territories so easily as being the realm of mysticism and supernaturalism, but that they are very naturalistic. They are things that are impactful and meaningful and transformative to our human lives in this lifetime.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a human talent to access sublime experiences. If one is slightly more religious, one might call them the numinous. If one is fully religious, then one calls them the transcendental because, one finds oneself speaking to God or the Virgin Mary or someone like that. But we should understand these experiences as experiences, and they are certainly what Zen practitioners would call Dharma gates. They are giving us access to experiences that are deeper and more meaningful than those we can get when we're plodding along with our everyday consciousness, what I aim to call marketplace consciousness.
And how about the fourth frontier?
The fourth one is intensity of practice. And it's interesting that one of the books I was reading at the time I was putting my speaker's notes together was a book by Paul Watson, so Peter Watson, called The Age of Atheists. And he goes through actually not so much atheists as post-metaphysical thinkers from Nietzsche, who basically got the whole tradition up and running, through to the present day. And he includes a number of well-known poets like Rilke and so on, who are saying a well-lived life is a life lived intensely. And it very much sort of reminded me of that wonderful dialogue in the Pali Canon. And the Buddha is an old man, and Mara, the personification of darkness and ignorance, who comes up and in his usual disguise as a friendly stranger and says, "Look, I can't understand why you're practicing so intensely. You've done it all. It's time to kick back and take it easy." And the Buddha's immediate response, of course, he can see through the disguise, and he says one should practice as if one's hair was on fire. And I think that, practice as if your hair was on fire was actually very good advice. And it's certainly the advice you get from practically all the major thinkers and writers that we find Peter Watson reviewing in his quite amazing and long book, that they are all coming down to the point that a life well lived is a life lived intensely. So we get this message coming through us in the Pali Canon. It's not a life lived austerely. It's not a life led under some severe discipline, but it's a life in which we turn towards the world, we turn towards our experience, and we go into them as deeply as possible. And for me, that is, very basic advice to any Dharma practitioner.
Yeah, it's interesting that the practicing like your head's on fire can be sometimes interpreted as practicing with severity rather than living your life with intentionality and unremitting intentionality to be present for it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it has nothing whatever to do with austerity. In fact, I think austerity is a wrong path if one is seeking to live intensely. To me, it's more like living as if one was a poet rather than as if one was a monk.
So when you deliver these programs, what kinds of questions would come up? How would the audience receive this program?
I've only run this particular workshop once, and that was here in Sydney to people who've had a pretty long exposure to Stephen and Martine Batchelor, as well as myself and others of like mind. So it didn't actually raise any hackles. The questions were all exploratory, actually. Some of the questions were kind of worried questions about, are we throwing some sort of baby out with some sort of bathwater? And those questions were usually laced with confession that they couldn't quite identify the baby or the bathwater. But were we losing something, going down this kind of path, and in a way, inevitably severing links with more conventional ancestral Buddhism? Of course, that is a big issue. It's an issue that has quite come up quite sharply here in Sydney because we have a very big Buddhist community, and I put community in inverted commas, because there's, I suppose the overwhelming majority, probably about 85% of them, would be from Buddhist diasporas. They're migrants who come in and, like many other migrant groups, they cling to the old religious traditions of their homeland as a marker of ethnicity, as a way of defending a particular kind of identity, Burmese, Thai, Japanese, whatever. And so the interests of those kinds of Buddhists are very different from those of Western practitioners for whom Buddhism has nothing whatever to do with reinforcing their ethnicity. In fact, it's probably going against the grain of their ethnicity, but they really want to use it as a form of existential deepening. So these sorts of, when one is raising these sorts of questions, having a free and open discussion of where is Dharma practice taking us, and therefore how should we approach it, these sorts of things usually make the blood freeze of a aspiring Buddhist. They really don't want to enter into those sorts of debates. And interestingly, here we've had the spectacle of Western converts to those conventional ancestral forms of Buddhism being in the front line of those attacking secular Buddhism.
Yep, yep. Those are always the ones I'm most challenged with. It's not my Nepalese or Sri Lankan or any Asian monastics. They've been wonderful and very supportive and understanding, and know that this is a cultural manifestation. We do need to find our own inroads and our own understandings of the practice. It's the converts that typically are the ones who push back because they've often abandoned something else, and they've just replaced the intensity of that template with an intensity of attachment to this done exactly this way.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we have a remarkable example in this country of someone who was, I think it was a theoretical physicist, who became a Theravadan monk, quite a charismatic teacher and very much a monastic chauvinist, who nonetheless decided to ordain women, which is, of course, a no-no in the Theravadan tradition. I mean, a full ordination as opposed to a kind of 10 precept ordination. And for his pains, he was instantly excommunicated. But then, as the spiritual director of a particularly important Buddhist centre in another city here in Australia, he issued an edict last December saying that any teacher at this venue, which was the biggest Buddhist venue in the city, would have to sign a piece of paper which affirmed rebirth and the idea that Sangha, the ordinary Pali word for spiritual community, meant monastics only.
Only. That's interesting.
Stephen Batchelor was due to speak there and on a debate precisely on rebirth. And he was invited by this centre to enter to participate in a debate on rebirth, but at the same time was banned from entering the venue because he couldn't or wouldn't sign the document. So the debate actually had to occur off campus, as it were. And of course, I am similarly covered by the ban, and any other secular Buddhist would clearly be covered by the ban, or indeed any Buddhist who interpreted Sangha as, in its natural meaning of a spiritual community, not just monastics. So it does actually illustrate the point that Buddhist diasporas can find rather overzealous champions among the kind of natives of the country they've come to.
It's rather surprising to hear from this particular monastic, as in light of his other history in the ordination of women as bhikkhunis and starting that up, a progressive idea with this attachment to. It's fine to have that belief in rebirth if that's your path within your tradition. That's fine, but to take it to the degree that you can't enter these halls without signing a piece of paper seems a bit anachronistic.
Well, it is, but you can understand his point in a way. I mean, certainly, or rather, the contradiction between his ordaining women when that was just not on according to his tradition, as opposed to defending the main tenets of it, because no religious institution deserves to survive if it can't get its head around gender inclusiveness. I think that was the point he understood, that the Theravada was signing its own death warrant if it carried on with this ludicrous and frankly unethical exclusion of women. So he, in a way, was trying to save this tradition from itself by ordaining women, and it didn't work apparently because he was excommunicated, and this year he was actually banned from an international Buddhist conference where he was going to give a paper on the importance of ordaining women. He was simply told not to come. I mean, he was entirely orthodox on the question of what Sangha means, and that we all get reborn. But certainly on gender politics, he just didn't fit. But I think it's that sort of nonsense that we really need to get away from. And the really good thing that's happened locally here in Sydney is that we've had our big dust up with conventional Buddhist institutions. It became very clear that we couldn't work in them or with them, and we've simply set up our own organisations entirely. It doesn't, occasionally we come across a progressive monk or nun whom we invite to come and give us a talk, but the whole idea of trying to share facilities or engage in common practices has basically been abandoned by secular Buddhists here in Sydney. And I think what's meant that it's happened faster here than elsewhere is because of the very high proportion of diasporic Buddhists we have in the population.
Yeah, and I think time will tell that, as evolutionary trends will show, is what is more successful in a wider populace will continue. And we see this in other religious traditions, that as people are more and more unwilling to accept some of the practices, some of the ideological stances of the more strict faiths, those lose people and they go to other things which are more consonant with the rest of their life. And I think we'll see this in Buddhism as well, that people are going to go to that which fits them best. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to engage in practices which can be challenging. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be reaching. There certainly will be. But I think the traditions may be challenged by their, shall we say, a lack of flexibility and extensibility once they've set a doctrine. they're stuck with that doctrine. And secular Buddhism is kind of stepping aside from that.
Well, yes, and it's very interesting that there seems to be a kind of tendency for people of particularly East Asian background to start coming to lay Buddhist and secular Buddhist groups here. And it's pretty clear that what they're hearing is something they've never heard before, despite the fact that they are born Buddhists, as the expression goes. So, and that's true. And I think there's, of course, a generational issue here that usually the children of these migrants have a very strong instinct to integrate into the host society. And so the temptation for them is to just give up on Buddhism altogether. And that I think is a shame. You know, I think that if they can be attracted to seeing the Dharma in a way that is working and is in fact being remolded into the host culture and see the importance for it in terms of how they live their lives, then that would be the ideal outcome.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the same thing here, Winton, in the United States, that Buddhist centers that are based on a particular ethnic demographic tied to a foreign host country. The people who have come over, they are from that country. That is their background. That's who they are. But their children are Americans. And even if they are engaging in regular schools as part of their parents' background, it's not theirs. And I don't know how long that's going to last or how well that's going to work in the long run. I suspect it's going to see a reduction in that continuity.
Yes, I think so. And it may well be that one has to drop out altogether before one drops in again to something quite different.
Well, Winton, thank you for sharing about this program that you've been doing. And I hope you're able to deliver this more and, in fact, can explore some other frontiers than just these initial four. I think you did a terrific job. On the ones you selected are the ones we keep stumbling on as secular Buddhists, that we don't need to have an aversion to religion. We don't need to have an aversion to the experiences of it, that there are things that we can learn from this. And what does that mean to us? And how can we interpret that such that it can be of benefit instead of tossing it all out?
Well, yes, I mean, in some ways that is well a crucial point because religions are storehouses of cultural history. I grew up as an Anglican, or I guess in American terms, an Episcopalian, and I'm a great fan of Thomas Cranmer, the man who penned the original version of the Book of Common Prayer in 1547. I mean, this man was a linguistic genius, a poetic genius. And one of the points I like to make is that when we look at our English language and the formative influences on it, it has supposed to be Shakespeare and the King James Bible, which I think is known as the Authorized Bible in the States. Where did they get their poetics from? These characters were, by law, required to go to church every Sunday and enter into rituals that had been penned by Thomas Cranmer. So Thomas Cranmer is really, in a way, the unsung hero of the story of the English language. And to go back to look at Anglican rituals or to even participate in Anglican rituals is to enter into a very important cultural space. I have a secular Dharma friend in Melbourne who himself has a good friend who's an Anglican priest there. And the Anglican priest told him that these days, of course, the Anglicans have a much gooier, more anodyne version of liturgy, which is the usual fare in an Anglican service. But every now and again, this minister puts on a sacrament according to the Book of Common Prayer, and he says the church fills up with atheists. because they love the poetry and the music. And so I think we ought to honour that. We should see how important. I mean, my CD collection is full of requiems because requiems have a kind of cultural exploration of issues to do with life and death that we somehow miss out on when we're just talking in discursive rationalist terms. And so we need to keep dipping back into our old religious traditions just to keep our existential instincts sharpened up.
Yeah, it's how do we appeal to our humanity? What is that? How do we do that? And that's one of the many ways to do so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is a point, of course, that Karen Armstrong and various other people make about religion, is that it is actually covering territory that has not yet been covered by other kinds of traditions. And we need to be sensitive to that.
Well, our guest today, Winton Higgins. You can find out more. Winton still from SydneyInsightMeditators.org. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, .org. That's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being here.
And thank you for calling.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.